Brother man, let me welcome you on Asvaye Explorer. So I'm gonna tell you what this was part of my imagination. This conversation that we are having, because I've been I don't know if I should say a secret admirer of you. So seeing this conversation coming to happen, I'm so grateful. When vision come true, it's just a blessing for me. So let me welcome you on Asvaye Explorer, brother man.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. I've seen some of your previous conversations, and it seems like this is a channel that's really bringing regular people on to talk about really important things that are happening and also tell their own stories. So I'm really proud to be part of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we do, and that's what we actually try to do by all means. And looking you are walking around, because I've been in Bloom for some time now, and I think I've seen you even on the previous years, seeing you walking around, especially places like UFS campus. I've been wondering to myself, Uba, what's your story? What you've got to share with the world. So and I think it's not only me who had these questions or maybe wonderings. Even I was talking to a friend of mine just before we come in, that and he was like, I've been seeing this guy, and I was like, I read his bio and it gave me chills. So I'm glad that today you are here to tell the story. However, before we get into the conclusion of your life, which is your current, your current bio, before we get into today's bio, I want us to take it back, when you're growing up in the streets of South Africa, growing up in the township, if it was in the township, and tell me, how was that for you?
Yeah, so I was born in a city. I was born in Johannesburg in 1998. I moved to Bloemfontein in 2007. I'd say that, when you look around, it's very clear that a lot of people that are born in my position, their goal is to become the middle class or to become wealthy, to try and live in a mansion one day and to have lots of power. And for me, I think it would have been very easy to take that route if I didn't have the consciousness that I have right now, which is that we live in a very unequal country, in a very unequal world, where many people are born in extreme poverty. And those who are born in cities, they live city lives, they live quite lavish lifestyles. They aren't really thinking about these sort of consequences of their lifestyle, and they aren't thinking about the power they have to help others and to change the structure, the system that keeps people in poverty. So it was very interesting for me to have this consciousness, but then to be in a space that doesn't allow that kind of consciousness. So you go to a prestigious public school. I went to St. Andrew's School here in Bloemfontein. It's a public school, but it's also one of those public schools that the people that are going to the school, they want to one day be rich and famous, and they see themselves as the top of the food chain. And I'm in this space, and at the same time I'm trying to lobby people in the space to think differently. So it was a really interesting upbringing of conflict, where all around you there's all this affluence, there's wealthy people, there's opportunities, but you also see that a lot of that opportunities is unconscious, it's oppressive, it's evil, it's bad, and you don't want to be associated with it. But I'd say that's the best way to describe my upbringing. You're really in this unconscious space as a conscious person, and you can imagine how tricky navigating that space is.
And like, in the process of growing up, what are the challenges that got to affect your self-esteem? You know, I'm saying this because, the challenges that affect our self-esteem, they become what one can say, maybe a blockage to the breakthrough. You tend to lose certain things because of those challenges. What was the challenge for you that
Yeah.
affected your self-esteem?
So if we now talk about it on a mental level, from a really young age, I've been reading a lot of books. I became very conscious really young. I was reading feminist literature. I was reading African philosophy. And it really strengthens your mind, and it makes you really focused on revolutionary politics and you develop the strong resolve from when you're younger. It almost reaches a point where a lot of people are relying on you. If there's a protest, you have to be there, otherwise it can't continue. You're like, I became the chief editor of the school newspaper, for instance, and then later on the university. So I'm taking a lot of responsibilities as well. I was heading up the chess club, the debate club, our community service initiative club I was also involved in. So when you're doing all of that, it's like you're not even allowed to have a mental health break. There's never a time where you're allowed to just not be there. So I think that strong resolve kind of meant that I didn't have a lot of attention to really think about how I was doing self-esteem wise, how I was doing mental health wise. I'd say I also wasn't really thinking a lot about social norms. Like, for instance, a lot of people growing up, they're thinking about, are they desirable? Does someone want to date them? Do they have social standing? Are they popular at school? Those are a lot of the questions that our society trains us to think about. But because I was so focused on this quote unquote revolution, or this revolutionary thinking, I was never thinking that. I was never thinking, okay, how many friends do I have? How do I get into this relationship in high school? And questions like that I was never asking. So I think a lot of the mental problems that come with that, like low self-esteem, dysphoria about one's own body, thoughts that one doesn't meet the standards of the world that we're living in, and it over focus on appearance and desirability. I think I was very immune to that, because from a young age my mind was so focused only on the revolution. If ever I felt inadequate, like low self-esteem or mentally bad, it was just because our revolution is failing. All the time we're trying to bring about changes to the world, and a lot of the things we try don't succeed. And you sort of think to yourself, okay, maybe I'm inadequate, maybe I'm going about
Brother
this
man, are you
wrong,
still there?
maybe as a person I'm not. Oh yes, I'm still here. Sorry, have you lost the audio?
Sorry guys,
Sometimes
I
you
think
think,
I lost him.
may
Sorry, brother man. You
oh
had a break.
no.
Yeah, you had a break there. I'm sorry. So
Oh, this
you
technology thing. Am I back?
yeah, you are back. We are here fully. Yeah, you can take it over then.
So I think a lot of the time when you're trying to do revolutionary things, you might fail. And I'm just explaining that if there's anything that affects me mentally, sometimes you think to yourself, okay, is the failure because of my own personal inabilities? Am I unable to lobby people together? Is it that I'm not charismatic enough? Is it my messaging is wrong? Is there something that I'm doing which is burning bridges? Because you've got radical activism, so you might be scaring people off. So sometimes mentally, it feels draining to lose, to fail, to suffer, to not succeed. And then you also feel like you are personally not adequate enough to carry out the revolution. So those are the thoughts I was having already back in high school. I don't think self-esteem for me was about my image, my body, my status, my friends. It was mostly about the big dreams that I had. And it feels like you're not adequate enough to reach them. I'd say that it's still a pervasive thought today. I'd say I still struggle a bit with failure. And when you're doing revolutionary things, you're going to fail a lot. And it really does knock you. Sometimes you feel like, what's the point of getting up and trying today if we're going to fail? But, at the end of the day, you have to power through it, and you just have to keep trying again. And some revolutions, they only succeed lifetimes from now. So you shouldn't root your mental health in success. You should root your mental health in the fact that you're doing the right thing, that you're fighting a good cause, that you're doing something that you believe in. And if anyone's struggling with mental health for the same reasons that I was, then I think just know that you're on the right path, and the destination is not what's important. What's important is that you are fighting a big struggle that won't just be defeated by your own efforts alone. You aren't inadequate. A lot of us have to come together to defeat it. Yeah, that's my message.
Yeah, man. And you saying you started reading books at a very young age. Were these developmental book or philosophical books? So the ones that you're reading, and tell me what really attracted you into books, because I'll tell you what, I started reading books, developmental books or developing books when I think I was really around my 20s. I'm still in 20s. I don't know what I'm saying. I was around like 20, 20, 20, 20, around the age of 20 and 19, around those age, towards the end of being a teenager. So
Yeah. So
now,
I think I was
yeah,
around
I
three when
want
I
to know.
started reading.
All right, you were around 3,
Yeah, no,
and what
I really, yeah, I really relate with this whole starting to read in your 20s. It's never too late to start reading. So I was around three, but I wasn't reading conscious works. I was reading Enid Blyton. It's like these kids stories, and there was this series called The Saddle Club, which I read in primary school. But when I was around three, it was these Darling Kindersley. I don't really DK. There's these children's books, you know, they teach you about electricity and amphibians and stuff. I think it's Dorling Kindersley or something. My mother had this clear agenda that we weren't going to have playing consoles like PlayStations and stuff. In our house, there was only these educational games and sorry, educational books basically. So I grew up reading like encyclopedia like books, you know, from preschool. So I wouldn't say it was conscious though. It was only in my high school years that I started reading conscious works. So I was reading a lot. I was reading novels and books, but a lot of those weren't about revolution. They weren't about the problems of the world. It's only in high school that I really started reading seriously about what's happening, and it was when I joined the library because I was an avid reader, and I started to pick up those dangerous books. You know, those books that only the radicals read. No one in my school would read books like that. So that probably happened around my teenage years. Yeah. And I would recommend that people read from a young age. I think a lot of the reason why we don't pick up reading later is because we don't develop the attitude to it when we're younger. You know, when people are 3, 4, 5, that's when we really need to slide some of the picture books and stuff their way. Then when they get into primary school, give them the novels, the nice stories. When they get to high school, just drop them with conscious books, really to for them to understand what's happening in the world that they starting to become more aware of. Because when you go through puberty, that's when you're really socializing and you're going out into the world. You've got 13-year-olds in nightclubs, and you probably won't even stop that from happening. So it's important that we just start reading conscious material. I mean, if 13-year-olds are going out, I think 13-year-olds should be reading powerful books as well. And so I think I started at a young age. I'd recommend anyone starts at a young age, and that's why we need more libraries in communities around the world. That's why we need to make books accessible. It shouldn't cost you a lot of money to read a conscious book. You shouldn't have to go all the way to one library in town, which is serving a population of millions. There should be libraries everywhere, in schools across the country, because at least, especially in fee-free schools, that's where a lot of young children are attending because that's all they can afford. But there aren't libraries in the schools, so they aren't necessarily reading conscious books. So we need libraries in schools across the country, and that's something we need to work toward.
Tiamo, and now you see when you say you would actually encourage people to start reading at a very young age. There's this time I was watching this debate that was talking about reading being a racial thing, that black people, they don't read. That's why black authors, they don't get to be at that level of being the best bookseller or number one bookseller, because they are black nation doesn't read in time, or it doesn't really enjoy reading. So tell me, is this a reading thing? How do you actually develop the reading habit now that you are here, and now that you're reading consciously or you're studying consciously? How do you develop that?
Yeah. So I keep saying that if you don't do it when a person's young, it's going to get a lot more difficult later. But first, I want to comment on this before I answer your question more directly. That reading is a
Yeah,
white
yeah.
person's thing. You can say the same for playing musical instruments. You can say the same for prestigious sports. You can say the same for the arts in general. There's a lot of things that lots of young upper middle class or white kids are exposed to, and as a consequence they really grow that culture from a really young age. It's not necessarily about the fact that they are white. It's more about the fact that they're given that opportunity at a young age to expose themselves to that kind of culture, and so they socialize in that direction. So to answer your question more directly, how do we develop a reading culture? Well, when someone's really young, they've got to be able to access books when they're really young, and they'll develop that culture on their own. There's no need to be paternalistic about it. We don't need to go into schools and force people to read. We just need to give them the opportunity to read, and people read on their own, and they'll develop that culture for themselves. So it's all about the structure of the world. If you go to many fee-free schools in South African rural and township areas and just look if they have libraries, they might not. And if they do, how well functioning is the library? How many books are there? Is it administered? But if you go to a prestigious, primary school, even a creche or a pre-primary, you'll find libraries. Some of them have hundreds, if not thousands, of books. One school has thousands of books, serving like 100 people that attend these prestigious private schools. Obviously, the people in those prestigious private schools are going to develop a culture of reading. The next thing that people read is for school curricula. And in South Africa, the school education system is obviously failing a lot of our young people. It's meant to be the entry into reading, but because the school doesn't have resources, some schools don't even have toilets. There's a lot of violence within a lot of schooling communities. After school activities aren't present. There's no funding and resources for things like that. It's not like there are reading clubs and so forth. It doesn't become a good avenue for someone to enter into the world of reading. Whereas at a prestigious high school, you've got people reading books, both as part of the curricula and outside the libraries. They've got reading clubs. So I'd say, a lot of us older people, especially those in universities, we should be going into schools and starting reading clubs or poetry clubs, places where people can express themselves and can read. And that's another way to get people into a reading culture. You could give them a short essay and then say, next week, come back and we'll have a discussion about this. People need to feel like they're part of a community as well. So, it's very difficult to target this on an individual level, to try and find one person and, introduce them into reading culture. Cultures are group activities by definition. So hypothetically, like if I started a reading club at a primary school and I got the people to read maybe something and then come back the next week and we discuss it, then when I'm discussing with my friends, it feels like we're all part of some community. And I feel like this reading is helping self-fulfill my role in society and the world. So I'd say that's a good model. Let's form a reading club and then people will develop a culture out of that sense of community. Yeah.
And there's one thing that I had question. I actually had question about education lately. You're speaking about our education in South Africa not being at the best level for us as people. I wish you can redefine or maybe define education in your own ways, because there's this thing that education is only through qualifications. Some people are actually discouraged to read because they feel like if they're reading by themselves, they're not getting educated or they're not educating themselves. Education is only identified through a qualification. And the reason I'm asking you to redefine or maybe to define the education thing is because there was a time when I met you and you were going in the library and I was like, hey man, how you doing? And have you registered this year? And you said, no, you're not actually enrolled for academics. And so you're just going library just to educate yourself. So, I think we have rare people doing that. If they are not allocated to a certain degree or maybe are enrolled to a certain qualification, they don't see themselves as getting educated. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
It's a very interesting story, firstly, because I was involved in a poetry club and a writers club, which were both hosted at the library. So I'm sure I was going there to do this very activity of reading and community that we were speaking about. But in terms of qualifications, yeah. So a lot of people get qualifications to get a job. You'll speak to someone at the university and you'll ask them if they're really there for knowledge. And maybe that might play a small part in it. But the bottom line is this qualification, this certificate, this piece of paper is going to signal to an employer that you have a skill and that you're worth being employed. And then you're going to get employed. And you might not even implement any of the things you learned at university. Some people don't even write their own assignments and essays and exams. They get someone else to do it, or they speed, they do it quickly, they rush it. They might not do it properly. I don't think there's an attention to knowledge within the university space. I think the rush for qualification has nothing to really do with education so much as it has to do with, I need to get a job, I need to survive in a capitalist world. At the same time, if you actually try and take dedicated time toward education, toward gaining knowledge and understanding the world, how do you survive? No one's going to hire you because you have a lot of information in your head. So if you actually take the time to try to improve your knowledge, then you won't survive. You won't get a job. You won't eat. So I also think the system of qualification is difficult to defeat because lots of people find it necessary to survive. So how do we defeat it? You obviously need to have an alternative way to access food, to access shelter, to access clothing. If all of our basic needs could be met, more people would be reading for information. More people would be doing arts. We would levitate or gravitate toward gaining information and knowledge leisurely in our free time because we'll have that free time and because we can afford to do that. But if you go to someone now, especially someone that works, they wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to work, sometimes 4 o'clock, and they get back at 7 or 8, and you ask them to read this book or this novel, something that's not going to help them put food on the table. If they have to choose between what's going to put food on the table and the book, they're going to choose what puts food on the table. And that's the qualification thing. Lots of people know that qualifications puts food on the table. And so that's why they're moving in that direction. And lots of people hate the university. You spoke about mental health earlier. It's really draining on their mental health. They really suffer to get through their courses. Many people are doing courses they never wanted to do. Many are struggling to pay for their fees. It's an awful experience for most people that go through it. But they're only doing it to get that qualification, that piece of paper, so they can one day get a job. And what's sad is a lot of people don't finish. A lot of people don't even get that qualification. They put themselves through all of that. And at the end of the day, they remain probably an unemployed youth. Our unemployment rate is now 34%. And you'd imagine that even if those 34% of people picked up a book and started learning things, they still wouldn't get a job. So there is a big distinction between the two. And I think it's easier for us to educate ourselves. It's easier for us to move in that direction of pursuing knowledge if our basic needs are met. So the first step of the revolution is to meet our basic needs. And then we can start to work on getting people to access libraries and reading clubs and read more and gain more knowledge. But at the same time, and I know this is a long answer, without consciousness, we might not even fight the revolution in the first place. It's only when we become more aware of capitalism and how the system oppresses us that we want to change it. And you get that information through sometimes reading, but there's other ways. Of course, books aren't the only way to become conscious. But I'd imagine if you at least engage conscious material in some way, maybe not full-length books, online articles and Facebook statuses of your friends or something, at least read what makes you conscious. Then it's possible that we can tear down the system, meet our basic needs, and then you'll have time to read a novel or so. Yeah.
Hey man, that gives me chills, because what you're saying is so true, brother man. It's something that I also had to go through. So what happened is I just got into this course, and during the the process of completing the course, I discover myself in that process, and I was super excited about my purpose, my passion that I discovered. So my academics started actually declining from that point, and it feels very bad to leave a course that you actually enrolled with. Tuition is being paid for that. People believe in you for that, and go for something that you just discovered by yourself, which is not gonna give you money at that time, but it's serving you before it serves others. So what you're saying is just like, it gives me chills, man. And now let's get to this point. You're talking about being conscious about things. Now I want to come to this angle of black consciousness. I don't know if you've read the book of Steve Biko, like Black Consciousness. They address black consciousness. So from where you're standing, do we have like self-love as black people? Do we have the sufficient self-love as black people to achieve our goals, to go according to our purposes in life?
Yeah, obviously, Black consciousness emerged not just as a literary book, but also as a movement, and as you mentioned, a lifestyle, a way of being. And I imagine that at the time, the idea was to not only defeat apartheid and the system of white supremacy, but to create, you call it Black love, an alternative Black structure, a world where Blackness is free and isn't even only defined relative to whiteness. So I think as long as the white structure persists, that we live in a world where we are compared to and we exist to serve whiteness, that black love that you're talking about is not possible. And so black consciousness doesn't exist in the form of black love and the pursuing of black goals, but for now, it exists to eradicate the system of white supremacy. And post the eradication of that system, perhaps we might be able to emerge into other forms of blackness, like black love. But I do not see how black love is possible in a world of white supremacy. And a lot of what we call black love exists only under capitalist forms of consumerism. So a black love is accessible to the elite and the middle class, or it's some vague, symbol of value that realistically isn't present. A lot of black life is suffering, and I mean, within that suffering, we might find ways to coexist and to form community. And you can call that community black love. I mean, you can define black love however you want. But I think black suffering is endemic to black communities around the world. As long as the system of whiteness oppresses us, there will be suffering, because oppression doesn't exist without suffering. So I'd say that let's tear down the system of white supremacy, and obviously at the same time tear down patriarchal systems, ableist systems, etc. Let's tear down all these systems that oppress us. And after that, as black people, and not just as black cisgender men, but trans black people, disabled black people, black women, etc., we can find ways to, queer black people to express ourselves in this world. So there's blackness, but then, not all black people are the same. There's some suffer from the oppression of whiteness and then from other oppressions in society. I'd say that as long as those oppressions exist, we can't conceive of any kind of alternative. So I'd say that for me, black consciousness is about eradicating that system and then being ready to finally move toward black love. Why can't we come together right now? It's also because we're competing, especially the system of capitalism makes us compete. But I'd say any oppressive system does. Like patriarchy really tells a little boy from a young age that we're better than women and non-binary people, and that's a form of gendered competition. So I'd say that there's a lot of telling black people that, okay, you need to be rich, you need to be a patriarch, you need to be ableist, etc. You need to be transphobic, you need to be queerphobic, and that will always divide black communities, with some black people trying to amass as much power within this oppressive system for themselves as they can. Like, you look at the story of black people that go live in expensive suburbs and live really as wealthy lives as they can under the system, ignoring all the poverty around them. How can you call that black love? There's no solidarity there at all. And I think it's because they're listening to the system whispering into their ear. And so they're developing an unconsciousness, which is relative to the system. But as you mentioned, if we develop a consciousness that's got liberation in mind, because black consciousness is about liberating ourselves from white structures, I think that we might move toward that world of black love. But we won't be there right now, as long as there are some black people among us that want to oppress the rest of us, or at least want to gain as much power for themselves as they can.
And now you're talking about, I want to make my way to the concept of feminism. Are you a Christian? Or what you...
such personal questions on live streams. this country. I think on the religious question.
Okay, let me ask it in this way, because this question is just an opening question. I want to get to the question where now we are at a situation where in our living years, feminism is so much encouraged that the thing that a girl child or a boy child is able to do, the girl can also do it. We're fighting so hard for equality in that level of feminism. So when we get into church, or maybe when we get to be religiously, we get to find that, or maybe we find that some of the principles that are rooted in the Bible, or maybe in ancient times, are actually going against feminism, which is something that is becoming like fashionable in the discussion of or of like communities or maybe nation. I wanted to come to this question: how do we balance those two? Or maybe, do you think there will be like a lifetime contradiction amongst these subjects, or maybe like the beliefs and the philosophies? Take me through that, man, because um, one time I
Yeah.
believed that I'm a feminist. One time I believed that I'm a feminist until we get to the point where I felt like my, should I say, manhood, my manhood is being challenged, and challenged in the way that makes me feel disrespected, you know, and therefore I came to think, oh, maybe that's why in ancient times they were saying this is for a man, or maybe this is how a man should be addressed, but right now we are in times where whether you're a man or you're a man or a female, you can actually open the door for anyone despite the gender critiques. Take me through that,
Yeah, I do think firstly that we
my
need to
utterance.
tear down
Yeah.
patriarchal systems. Yeah. Yeah, I do think firstly that we need to tear down patriarchal systems. A lot of young boys, as you mentioned, it's maybe they want to sort of escape the system of patriarchy because it's bad for everyone. It's most bad for women and non-binary people. But even as men, patriarchy whispers in your ear and it tells you that there's certain things that you have to do to be a man. Even if you didn't want to do that, you sort of feel compelled and forced by patriarchy to do these things, and it can even come at a great harm to yourself, your mental health, your self-esteem, etc. Lots of men suffer from muscle dysphoria, high suicide rates, etc. So patriarchy is obviously bad for men too. And so we should all be, distancing ourselves from that structure. But you're absolutely right that even those that internally feel like, okay, I need to be less patriarchal, when it comes down to it, we choose culture, tradition, the church, and those norms that have been inculcated under us, and we feel like we have to fulfill the norms of our society and of the institutions that we're listening to. Or, if you talk about groot man culture, the men that are above us, or the other men that are looking our way, like, maybe internally you feel that struggle with patriarchy, but then when you look at other men and and you see the pressure that they put on you, you think, okay, no, I must do this patriarchal thing because other men are watching, or older men are watching, or men I look up to, who are my role models, are watching. So yeah, it is the case that these institutions sort of drive men right back into patriarchy, and it's up to us to stop listening to them, to just say that patriarchy is bad for everyone, including myself, and I'm going to reject that system. If we go back to the church, now the church can function as an individual belief. It can also function, as you mentioned, as a doctrine, which is a certain non-changeable code. It can also function as an institution, which are the buildings, the organization. So organized religion would then fall under that category. So I'd say that there are a lot of people in the first category, who have individual beliefs that are compatible with social systems. These are humanitarian faith believers. These are radical religious believers. In South Africa, there used to be something called the Journal of Black Theology. And this journal was really radical in its approach to Black politics and gender as well, but primarily on Black politics as a vague whatever Blackness means generally, not necessarily too over focused on other oppressions. But it is a really progressive, but I'd actually also say a very radical platform. But these people are also individual believers. So that's definitely possible. It's not that it's incompatible to have faith, spirituality, and or some kind of belief and have radical politics. The danger comes with the second and the third. So the second are people that follow particular doctrine. Sometimes they're called fundamentalists, and they interpret that doctrine in very extreme ways. And those extreme ways can be very oppressive. Then the third are institutions. Now, institutions are hierarchical. Sometimes these institutions are corrupt. You have churches that exist only to make money, etc. You can go on and on about the problem of churches as institution bodies. And those can also function in ways that are bad for society, that entrench bad norms. Like you have a lot of religious denominations that say that women must be subservient, or that to be queer and to be trans is a religious crime or an abomination of some sort. And those are carried out by those institutions that have power, and they use their money and their status and their influence to control what people think about identities and regular human beings. So I'd say the danger are those that interpret doctrine in very dangerous ways, and the danger are the institutions, religious institutions that are organized that entrench dangerous norms. But I don't think the danger is in individual belief in and of itself. And there's a lot of people that hold individual beliefs and are also radical. And it would be better for the entire world if a lot more religious people were in the first category of holding an individual belief and aligning that with radical politics, than in the second category of people that interpret doctrine in dangerous ways, and the third category of people that are members of institutions or organizations that oppress.
I see. And this question, I know it's such a controversial question, fitting in the idea of feminism into today's world, especially from men's side. I know it's such a very controversial conversation that we can have. Now let us go where you started. Vocal Revolutionaries program. What is it that you guys were being vocal about there? Firstly,
yeah, so I'd like to talk about poetry in general.
Yeah, firstly, let us start. Just give us a full explanation of what the program stands for and what is it, where people can find it, if it still exists, and tell us what is it that you guys were actually being vocal about there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the program still exists. I was only involved with it in 2015. So that's how I got my start into poetry. Vocal Revolutionaries was based in Cape Town. It was a poetry collective that was hosting slams and was sending teams to the international youth poetry slam, which was hosted in the United States, which had people from around the world, but mostly United States poets competing. What were we vocal about? I mean, if you've seen slam poetry, you'll see they're talking about very serious topics like rape and sexual offense. They're talking about blackness and white supremacy. They're talking about all the evil injustices of the world. But, at the same time, poets are also vocal about death and romance and nature and things that are individual interests as well. I personally was writing a lot about death at the time, and then I began writing about social justice. I mostly see poetry as a means to express my philosophies, of which I have many. Nowadays, I'm running around with a group called Po Club, which I founded at the University of the Free State in 2018. And we write a lot. Like, we write about sadness and misery. We also write about social justice, writes about gendered issues, love. You've got a lot of romantic poetry as well. That's one of the biggest aspects of poetry, I'd say. Going back to the conversation you had on Black love a bit earlier. So, Vocal Revolutionaries, I think, was just my start. It was just something that told me that poetry can be powerful. But I was only involved in that program in 2015. Nowadays, I'm just with Po Club.
Yeah. And what's your comment on today's art history? Do you think we have a real one?
No, of course it's real, but the problem is there's different categories of artists. Just like I mentioned earlier about the different categories of religious denominations. You have artists that are doing art from a revolutionary perspective. So that's myself and some other artists. There are people who are doing art to make money, and that might be for survival, but it could also be to make money so that they can become rich one day and then become a capitalist and oppress people and so forth. Then you've also got people that are making art just as a part-time hobby, just as some side thing. It's not that serious. It's not like the revolutionaries that are trying to change the world or the capitalists that are trying to make money and become oppressors. These people are just doing it, for fun or as leisure or as a side thing. So obviously you've got very different kinds of artists. The dominant in terms of an industry will be those capitalists. They're the ones that will control organizations and institutions. Those that are doing it for the hobby, because they're not that serious about it. They don't really vie for power and control over art. The revolutionaries get excluded from the space. So they're taking it seriously and they want to make art full time, but the space doesn't accommodate revolutionary artists. Certain content doesn't make you money. No one's going to book people. It's sad, but it's also a good thing because it means as revolutionary artists, we need to take down the structure. We shouldn't try and find a place in it because it's not built for us. So I'd say art is real. The art industry is real, but it's very capitalist right now. And I'm part of a magazine called Culture Review Magazine. I'm the editor there, and we've got a very different approach. We're a revolutionary magazine. We write about arts and Black life in general, and we're trying to create a space for all those revolutionary artists to find expression. You're not going to find that expression in mainstream or capitalist-oriented industries. There was that hashtag "Open Up the Industry" a while ago, and what's very interesting about that movement is there was some undertone there that there are deserving artists who are not getting their fair share of the cake. But it's not a movement to give all artists cake. It's a movement to give those quote unquote deserving. And it's always interesting. What does it mean to be deserving? Does it mean you meet the standards of desirability? Does it mean that you're performing in the kind of ways that, those who have money expect you to perform? Or, there's white gaze, there's male gaze, there's capital gaze. That's like where you're performing for white people, you're performing for men, or you're performing for people with money. Are those the deserving artists? So when we say open up the industry, I think that's a misguided activism, because it doesn't seem to end with destroying the industry. It's just trying to find our place in it. Whereas I think maybe then I can say that art is unconscious. It's real, but the art industry is unconscious right now, and we need to make it a lot more conscious.
And one of the things that you talk about in the space of poetry is sadness. Which part, or maybe what sadness are you referring to? Are you talking about some things like depression? Are you talking about something like exclusion? Are you talking about things like being eliminated? Because as you're saying that there's some people that are actually getting rid of, because of what they say, because of what they stand for. What sadness are you guys talking about there or writing about?
That's a good question. Of course, you can look at sadness as a consequence of a cause. So there's something that has happened, an event, and sadness is a reaction or response to that event. Like maybe your relationship ends and you feel sad as a consequence of that cause. You can also look at sadness as an engagement with a structure. So you're oppressed every day, you're dehumanized, you're told that you're not a person, and you feel sad not as a consequence of a specific event, but as a general attitude toward life, and that you could describe as depression because it's endemic, consistent, and is a response to some kind of structure. You can also look at sadness as an absence, the absence of happiness, as maybe a numbness, usually how it's referred. So there's many creative ways to think about sadness in the world. I think crucially, sadness can also just be seen as something that demotivates, that prevents you from getting up in the morning, from working, from doing things that make the world better. It's basically something that tells you to stop when you want to go, if you want to put it that way. But there's many different interesting ways of looking at it. Of course, poets use metaphors. They might describe sadness as drowning, or as a bird that is unable to fly. Really powerful ways to look at the concept. But I do think happiness is probably possible in the world. I just don't know how easy it is to access happiness in a world that is constantly inducing you into suffering.
And now I want to come to this part of you being as a philosopher. Uh, I guess this is a recycled question, because I was asked this question from one guy, but we are not strictly talking about philosophy. I had this sense, and I stand to be corrected. I had this sense where uh, I felt like the ancient philosophies do not make way in today's life. Like we have to develop our philosophies as current generation, uh, and even the proverbs that were made, I felt like we needed to update them according to like to our living years. For instance, I'll go back. I remember the other guy. So here on the Asvaye, it's a company. We're doing a lot of things right here. So this person was like, "You guys are doing a lot of things, and it will be difficult for you to win." And I took the criticism, the criticism, but at the same time, this person was referencing with this proverb that says, remember, the saying says, you cannot chase, as a dog, you cannot chase two rabbits at the same time. And this person continues saying now, you cannot work for two kings at the same time. But I'm looking at today's life. People are working, people are in art, yet they're doing other things. You know, I think the I think the proverb is no more relevant, but I stand to be corrected since you're a philosopher and from where you're standing with your philosophical perspective and perception. Tell me about these ancient philosophies fitting in today's life.
Yeah, so there's two parts to this question. The first is on proverbs. I'll speak on that first. And the second is on
Yeah, yeah,
ancient philosophy. So, a proverb, if you read a book called African Orature by Dr. Mugo, I believe they're a Kenyan philosopher. And also, I believe you can also read Sophie Oluwole's Socrates and Mila, which is also about classical philosophy, and I'll talk more on that in a second. A proverb is just a way of converting a philosophy into a meaningful phrase. So this person who says that you cannot chase two rabbits with a dog, behind that proverb is an underlying philosophy which can be challenged. And philosophy is the process of systematic inquiry. So a proverb isn't true just because it's a proverb. A proverb is just a way of converting complicated philosophy into a saying. I don't think we should reject proverbs on that basis. We should look at the philosophies that underlie the proverbs and then engage at that level. So, and that gives me the question on ancient. You used the word ancient. I used the word classical. Classical philosophy, which in Africa there is also classical African philosophy. For instance, you can read the Odu Ifa, which is the a Nigerian text with classical Nigerian philosopher. One of the philosophers' names there is Mila, who was alive a really long time ago, and also had a lot of sayings too, you could say. So, I'd say with classical African philosophy, there are things we can definitely learn from, and I would recommend using it as a framework to develop our philosophies. All philosophies can be engaged, criticized, critiqued. You can take from it what is meaningful and then add your own information to it. But I don't think we should start from scratch. I believe when you start from your ideas from scratch, you make the same mistakes as other people. You might think that the earth, is the center of the universe, for instance. That's what happens when you start from scratch. So I do think we're meant to use classical philosophy as a basis for us to develop. And I write a lot on African metaphysics, which is just one of many branches of philosophy. And I wrote an entire review on this book by Sophie Oluwole called Socrates and Urinmila. And this book just goes quite deeply into classical African philosophy as it relates to metaphysics, which is about being and existence. And I do think it's got lots of good points that it makes, which I won't go into all of them right now. But I do believe, to answer your question more directly, yes, we can look at classical African philosophy and we can learn from it, but it doesn't mean we must accept all of it. And obviously, we need to develop from it. But I fear that a lot of people haven't even read a lot of texts. Like a lot of us haven't engaged with much African classical philosophy. I mean, we've engaged a bit with some contemporary writers. You can mention, for instance, Achille Mbembe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, some of the most popular African philosophers. Some, they're still alive today, but a lot of classical African philosophy hasn't been read. I'd say that, for instance, I was mentioning Mugo, African Orature, Sophie Oluwole, although Sophie Oluwole is also a bit recent, but they write a lot on classical old texts. And one of the things that I do is I'm currently reading a lot of African texts. I'm still at the beginning of my journey, so I don't want to sound like an expert. It will probably take many years before I've read a lot more text. But I would recommend that let's engage classical or ancient philosophy and only take from it what we believe is useful for developing our philosophy in the present. But I don't think we should just abandon it or throw it away. Otherwise, we're going to start from scratch, and that's not going to be really helpful.
Yeah, let's get to the ones that you have constructed. Let's just get to and get to understand the ones that you have created right now. Because what you said at the beginning, man, it's so true. When you say, we shouldn't actually be driven by success, because success can actually be a lie. We can actually experience success after you have lived or it's just a lifetime thing, you know. That's so true for me. And right now, let me get to the ones that you have constructed. Two or one, just to get to understand uh, things from your angle.
My philosophy there, my approach to life, I guess. So, as I've been talking, on this call, my message has been really consistent. I'm an anarchist, which is both a political position and a philosophical position. It means that I want us to live in a world, without states, without corporations, where people get together voluntarily and we produce goods for communities and services. We all put into the commons, and then we all take from the commons. So I'd say that's the first aspect of my philosophy. The second aspect of my philosophy is, of course, to understand a lot of the problems in the world as things that must, structures that must be taken down. And only once they're taken down is it possible for us to maybe create some kind of alternative. Like, I can't even imagine what liberation looks like in a world where we are oppressed. Because even in the way that I understand liberation, it's going to be through the lens of my oppression. In other words, I'm going to position what it's like to be a liberated black person as being free from white people or whiteness as a structure. But then my own definition of liberation relies firstly on the existence of whiteness as an oppressive force. So let's say the oppression doesn't exist. I don't have a definition of liberation anymore. So even in the way that we understand ourselves, the way we understand everything, the structure's already there. The oppression's already there. Once we get rid of it, who knows what might happen? We might develop an entirely different consciousness that I can't even predict or describe right now. So I look forward to that world. It's actually the end of this world. Maybe that's another way to summarize this philosophy. I want the end of this world, the end of the world entirely, and then an entirely new world that I can't even begin to describe now. Hopefully, will emerge organically from there. I don't know. I think those are some of the strong philosophies I hold.
And you sound to have a positive, not affirmation, but a positive comment on failure. Man, I don't know if I should say a victim of failure. I don't think it's something that can victimize a person, but I've been a friend of a failure for a long time, to such a point where a thick skin was actually developed by default or unconsciously, fake, to such a point where failing is no longer an emotional thing, personal thing, something that triggered me anymore. And this, now I want you to go deep with the comment that you have simply made on failure. What do you have to say about failure? Because I actually want to understand where these positive utterances are coming from. Positive utterances on failure. I want to understand where they're coming from. Because I mean, people hate failure, man. Nobody wants to fail unless there's a secret that they know or something that they know, and it is not out there to be, or it's not known. Let me put it like that.
Yeah. When you come to understand that we live in a world that doesn't want you to succeed with your individual passions, but also as a race, as a gender, as a people with disability, as a sexuality, as whatever identity someone may hold, you'll understand that there are groups of people that in this world are oppressed, and the world doesn't want them to succeed. When you understand that, you know that the failure is not your fault. It's not that you have an inadequacy as an individual, it's that you're born in a world that doesn't allow you to succeed. So when you respond to that failure in a negative way, if you put yourself down, if you tell yourself you're inadequate, the system wins. The system wants you to think that you're failing because you're inadequate, but really you're failing because the system's against you. Now, this is not a victim mentality. Like, a victim mentality is one where even if you do make individual mistakes, you still position yourself as a victim. Even if you're a perpetrator or a powerful person, you'll still find a way to victimize yourself. That's not the same thing. This is about being conscious of the structures of oppression in the world and how it makes it more difficult for you to succeed. But secondly, I'd say that when you've got this consciousness of revolution, of wanting to end all the suffering in the world, it can make a lot of the other failures seem a bit insignificant. Like whether you win this race and whether you your team wins the football competition or tournament or whatever, or some of the smaller little goals that we set for ourselves in life, whether you get into the university for that course or you get that job, those things seem a lot less important than the revolution. Once your consciousness is you want to fight, you want to tear down the structures of the world. Along the way, there are things that aren't going to work out. Maybe someone you have a crush on rejects you or something. Those failures won't seem that important against the grand mission that you're fighting. So I'd say that the way we orient our minds, our consciousness, it does affect how we view failure. So I don't know if it's that I view failure positively. Like, I don't think it's a good thing, obviously, but I'm just so focused on a much grander vision that these smaller failures seem more insignificant.
Yeah, and I read I read the book by she's a psychologist in America, Carol Dweck, The Mindset. I read the book. She was talking about the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. One of the things she got to articulate there was, which complement what you just said. She was like, we're not in this world to prove our intelligence or to prove how smart we are, how clever we are. We're just here to use the resources that are presented in our way just to become the people that we desire to be. Which I guess if there was no like those systematic structures, that was going to be an easy thing. You know, I don't know if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I do think it's in the mind, it's in the consciousness. That's really
Yeah,
important.
yeah.
If you've lost the battle within your mind, you will lose it within the world.
I like that. I like that, man. I like that. And now let's come to the point where you review film and television, and that thing even gave you like international acclaim. Take me through that. What was happening around that point?
Yeah, so I do recommend that everyone read Culture Review magazine. That's a very revolutionary black magazine. You can find it online, culture-review.co.za, on social media, Twitter, at Culture Reviewed or Culture Review Magazine. If you just search that, you'll find us. Also on Facebook and Instagram. How did I get involved? So, there was a time I had Facebook. I don't have Facebook anymore. I no longer support Mark Zuckerberg and them. And I used to put long posts up, like every young revolutionary trying to change the world through Facebook statuses at the time. These days I do more on the ground work. And I posted this long update about Blood and Water, which was one of South Africa's earliest major entries to Netflix as a series. And it had a lot of acclaim back then. It's still got a lot of acclaim today. And I was really frustrated with the politics of Blood and Water and some other technical aspects. And I wrote a long post on Facebook. And one of the people who had started up Culture Review actually messaged me on Facebook and said, why didn't you write a review and then submit it? So I wrote a review and I sent it into Culture Review, and they published it, and it got 3,000 views, and lots of people shared and engaged with it. And some people felt it was a really refreshing take, and not many platforms were being quite critical about the series, for obvious reasons. We want to prop it up. It's on Netflix. There's the structure of we need to speak positively about these shows, even if they're unconscious. So that's how I first got involved in Culture Review magazine. Then I put up another piece about Black America's King, which was talking about the structure of Beyonce's Black is King. There was a lot of discourse about that, when it came out at the time. And that one got 30,000 views, largely because it mentioned No Name in the piece, and No Name had re-upped it onto their Twitter. And so that's why a lot of people internationally also engaged with it. And then after that, I took over as chief editor at the magazine. That was about a year ago. I did pause for a short while because I was running a political campaign, but I'm chief editor again now. And the story is continuing. And what Culture Review magazine does is we write reviews of films, of books. We write political posts. We write about history. We've got a really strong contributors, from around South Africa, writing about blackness. Our tagline is concerning blackness. We're all about blackness. We're a diversity of views. I'd say that we put up, 4 to 5 posts a week. It's quite a lot. We're quite a consistent platform, and it's been an amazing journey so far. There's some challenges, obviously, but I like what we're trying to achieve and how revolutionary it is.
Well, man, congratulations of being a chief editor. Congratulations. And now let's get to your writing skills, your skills as a poet. These are not the things that you know, these are not the things that we're exposed to, especially as people from township. I remember we had things like a debate where I'm coming from at school, secondary on the secondary level, but people were not so much convinced or motivated that they should join debate because it looked like it was only something that was going to end at that level. You know, when we started this platform, we wanted to bring all the things that seem to be impossible, but there are still people that are doing it who come from where we come from, who actually had same experience with us, running out of electricity sometimes, having to point out the taxi. So as 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 people, we realize that our young brothers and sisters, they are actually limited in terms of dreaming. They only dreaming of being police or doctor because these are the things that they see frequently in their community, because policies are always there to reduce crime. Doctors are always there to look after a sick society. But being a poet is, I mean, some young people out there, they don't really think that being a poet can actually open ways for you. Give us incentives around I mean, you around the poetry concept.
Yeah. So you're right. The state funds the police also because the police oppresses its people and keeps the state in power. So obviously state resources go toward the police, whereas state resources don't go toward the arts, not to the same degree and sometimes not at all. And so you're right that someone will look forward to becoming a police officer because they're guaranteed money and power, whereas a poet is not. I was also a member of a debate club in high school, and I continued debating in university. It's a great thing. I'd recommend that people do continue debate, and we need a lot more debate programs in schools. In terms of the arts, I'd say that, yeah, I wouldn't recommend people do the arts for money, but I would recommend that people still engage in the arts. It's a way for us to have identity, for us to exist as people. A lot of us exist, as just members of society, doing what society expects us to do, waking up each morning the same way, doing the same routine. Our lives aren't very unique. We don't actually engage with ourselves, our souls, our being. And arts provides an opportunity for that, arts and spirituality and a few other things. They give us the opportunity to be ourselves. And so I do recommend that people do art from that perspective. But I also understand the structure. People need to eat. And that's why I keep saying that the first thing we need to do, find a way for everyone to have access to food, like food gardens and community kitchens. Find a way for everyone to have access to clothing and shelter. And I think more people will do arts on their own. I think there would be less people that aspire to become police officers and doctors if we lived in a world where your basic needs are accounted for. And I think people will go into arts on their own. But if you can, I do recommend you do it. Like we're working on opening an art center right now to teach people to play musical instruments for free, to have poetry workshops, to allow people to express themselves visually as well, fashion, graphic design, wall murals, things of that nature, where we can express ourselves through a variety of art forms. Like there's skateboarders as well, photography. There's so many different kinds of art that people can look forward to. And that's the kind of center we're looking to create. It's what the state should be doing. The state should be funding art centers in every community so that people can go to a building and practice art. After school, instead of being involved in gangs and violence, young children could be doing arts instead. A library where people can also read and write, writing as a form of art too. So I think the first reason we don't see a lot of that is because people need to make money to survive in the system in order to access food. And the second is because the state isn't funding art centers. So it's up to us as people to create these art centers ourselves, and we're working on that. And I think if a lot more people joined that kind of a struggle and helped us build up our arts communities and art centers, more people would be doing arts, especially from a young age, especially people in areas where there are no art centers, in rural and township regions. Yeah.
And since now you are in the process of building those like art centers, um, if someone want to join or want to help, or yeah, how can they do that? How can they really do that?
So I only have Twitter. I don't have other social media. You can find me on Twitter at Tsimalachi, Chimalachi, TSHI Malachi, which is Malatji. You can just send me a DM. I mean, they could contact you and you could put them in touch with me. You can also send me an email. My emails are always open. It's Malatji, that's my surname, Malatji, at protonmail.com. Or you can just send it to Malachi at pm.me, pm.me. It's the same email address. It will still get to me. Just pop me an email, pop me a DM on Twitter. Let's work together. If you're located in Bloemfontein, that's so much better because that's where I'm located. But no matter where you are in the country, let's build our arts communities. I look forward to that.
Well, thank you, man, and thank you for availing yourself for this interview. I have I think two questions to ask. What is your wish for Africa?
I have many wishes. I guess liberation is the top of the list. I want us to have a different consciousness, one where there is no oppression at all. That's my wish.
And I wanted to ask this question, and it actually does my mind. I wanted you to comment on the racism thing. You sound to have more comments on the racism thing. Were you a victim of racism somewhere somehow?
Yeah, we all are. If you're black, you're going to experience anti-blackness. So of course, there's the liberal way of looking at racism as individual incidents or ethnic slurs, and we've all suffered through that experience. But you'll also know that it gets even worse when you're more vulnerable. At least I'm a person with a bit more power. I've got a huge following on social media. I've got a magazine I'm a chief editor of. Some people know me, whatever. But then when you have no power at all, especially maybe you're homeless, for instance, it gets even worse, I'd say. So it compounds, but that's still within the very liberal way of understanding it. I think a much more conscious way of understanding it is to look at uh, white supremacy as a structure, and anti-blackness is what we all experience. It's the reason why black people struggle to get a job, or don't see themselves entirely as human, or are hungry and starve, or many die, or are involved in violence and drugs and gangs. And a lot of things can be explained as anti-blackness and other oppressions that act on us. So I wouldn't say one person is a victim of racism and is black and another person is not. I think all black people will experience anti-blackness of a different kind and to a different degree, but generally it's an experience we'll all have. Yeah.
Yeah, man. And this is a question that comes from, like, this one is not for many people, but this one it's for me. What encourage, or maybe what's the motive behind your simple appearance? You appear to be simple, man.
Oh,
Why is that so? Is that by
yeah.
intention,
We
or
don't
is
need
just
much.
something?
Yeah, a lot of us have given into consumer societies for various reasons. Like maybe it gives us status and power. A lot of us think that in order to be human or to express ourselves in society, we need a lot. I don't believe it's true. I think we get more fulfillment out of engaging our souls, our spirits, our art than we will ever get from engaging physical material. The rate at which we're consuming is it's going to result in the end of the world, really, through climate change. It's real bad right now. And but more importantly, like where do we get the money for all of that? Like if you want to uh, buy lots of clothes and things and goods, they cost a lot of money unless you're making it all yourself. I also feel like I'm more proud of things that I can create with my own hands. And obviously if you're making things yourself, you can't make a lot of it, so it's going to be basic and simple, and it's going to sometimes you aren't that good at it. So if you stitch your own clothes together, it might not look that good when you start. So your appearance is going to be of someone who's just starting out, and you can't get good at everything. So I think we need to do away with this expectation on us to be consumers. It's also what traps us. Other people are owners, and we're all consumers. So because we're so concentrated on appearing to look like we have things, the irony is it's because we're buying so much and we're taking all of our salaries, money, and we're giving it to all these brands. They're the ones that end up owning us. We don't own them. They own us. I also think desirability is something we need to do away with. There's no one human being that's more desirable than another. There's nothing that you or I can do that should increase our desirability. Someone shouldn't be more desirable than another person. I don't believe that either. So I guess the basic appearance is intentional, but it's not like I'm doing it for anyone. I'm not even doing it for myself. It just comes very naturally to me. I think it's just a consequence of my consciousness. Because I'm not giving into society, I look basic. But it's not like I wake up in the morning and I plan to look basic. Like people plan to be consumers. It's very natural.
Brother man, I don't get enough of you. And one last thing, um, what would you say about this platform in closing?
I think it's good. I think we need to collaborate more. You've got this platform, reach out to other platforms. Let's all work together to expand our reach. Like, if 100 people are watching this and 100 people are watching another channel, if those two channels work together, they've got 200 people. But a lot of our platforms are competing with each other. But I do like this. I like the fact that you're bringing on regular people. You're not just trying to chase celebrities so that you can get clicks. Instead, you're trying to build a strong community. I think keep going, and we support you every step of the way.
Brother man, thank you. And your thinking is really like it's triggering. I don't know how many people have claimed sapiosexuality on you, but your intelligence is really attractive. Thank you so much for showing up and respecting us, man. And one love all the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you for all the viewers. I know some of you might be viewing live. I appreciate that you took some time out to watch. Some of you might be viewing afterwards on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much. And let's continue this conversation.
God, I'm just a student, you're my teacher, yeah. When you send a message, I receive, yeah. Wash away the pain on all your people, cause they're caught up in the shackles, only you can free them. I've been analyzing, and I just started realizing good line of life in, buns in my feeling, yellow writing. After the thunderstorm and the lightning, my focus is shifting to the